Her name is Amber Fletcher. She is 35 years old, and for most of her life, she learned what it felt like to be invisible inside her own family. 6 months ago, her husband vanished in the middle of the night. No warning, no explanation. He left behind divorce papers signed with his name, as if everything they built together meant nothing. By morning, he was gone, and so was their daughter. The house felt untouched, almost staged, like someone had erased an entire life in a few quiet hours. Her father didn't look surprised. He told her to sign the papers, to stop wasting time, to accept what had already been decided for her. He said men like that always leave, that she should have known better. But Amber didn't sign, because something didn't feel right. The man she married didn't disappear without a reason. Not like that. Not without a word. So she waited. She searched. And for 6 months, she lived between doubt and denial until the day everything broke open again. She saw him. Not in the life he once had, but somewhere he was never supposed to be, working like a stranger, looking like a man who had lost everything. And when he finally told her why he left that night, it didn't just explain the past. It destroyed everything she thought she knew. Before we get into this story, tell me what time you're watching this and which city you're in. I want to see how far this story reaches. And if stories like this pull you in, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Years before Ryan ever became part of her life, Amber Fletcher had already learned how quickly a family could turn into something cold and distant. Growing up in the Fletcher household never felt like belonging. It felt like being tolerated. Her father rarely spoke to her unless it was correct something, and when he did, his tone carried more disappointment than expectation. Across the same dining table, her older sister was treated like the future of the family, praised for every small success, included in conversations that Amber was never invited into. It wasn't just favoritism. It was a quiet decision made over years, one that placed Amber outside the circle long before she understood why. By the time she was old enough to notice the difference, it had already shaped everything about how she saw herself. When arguments started happening more often, they never ended in resolution, only in silence that lasted longer each time. That eventually, silence turned into distance, and that distance became something permanent. She left the house with nothing but a suitcase and a decision that she would never ask for anything from them again. For 5 years, Amber lived on her own, working jobs that had nothing to do with the family business, learning how to survive without the name that once defined her. During those years, no one from her family called. No one asked where she was, and over time it became clear that they had accepted her absence as something final. When she finally returned, it wasn't because she was invited back. It was because she had built enough on her own to walk in without asking for permission. Her presence didn't bring warmth, it brought tension. Her father acknowledged her success, but only as something useful, not something to be proud of. He gave her a position in the company, not as a second chance, but as a calculated move, placing her in a division that required discipline and results. Amber accepted it without hesitation, because she understood the rules now. Nothing would be given freely. Everything had to be earned in silence. That was the life she stepped into. Controlled, measured, and constantly observed. It was during that time, away from boardrooms and expectations, that she met Ryan Cole. He didn't come from the world she was used to, and that was exactly what made him different. There was no calculation in the way he spoke, no hidden tension behind simple gestures, and for the first time in years, Amber found herself around someone who didn't see her as a position or a mistake that needed correcting. Their connection didn't happen all at once. It grew in small moments that felt real in a way her life never had. When they eventually got married, it wasn't celebrated by her family. It was quietly judged. Her father never said it directly in front of Ryan, but his disapproval showed in every interaction, in every conversation that ended too quickly, in every look that dismissed him before he even spoke. Amber chose to ignore it because she believed, she had already survived worse. And for a while, it felt like she had finally built something that no one could take away from her. Pressure didn't arrive all at once. It built quietly in the spaces Amber Fletcher couldn't control. After the wedding, life didn't change in ways people would expect. There was no celebration that brought her family closer, no moment where acceptance replaced judgment. Instead, everything continued, as if nothing significant had happened, except the atmosphere around her became more measured, more deliberate. Her father never confronted her directly about the marriage, but his silence carried more weight than words ever could. Showing up in meetings, where Ryan Cole's name was carefully avoided, in decisions that excluded any mention of her personal life, in the way conversations shifted, the moment she entered the room. It wasn't open rejection. It was something more calculated, a slow pressure designed to make her question whether she had made a mistake. Amber refused to respond to it because she had learned long ago that reacting only gave him control, so she focused on her work, expanding her division, proving results that couldn't be ignored. For a while, that strategy seemed to work. Numbers spoke louder than opinions, and her position became harder to challenge. But control didn't disappear, it adapted. Subtle changes began to appear in areas she hadn't expected. Contracts delayed without explanation. Internal approvals taking longer than usual. Decisions redirected through channels she didn't oversee. None of it was obvious enough to confront, but together, it created a pattern she couldn't ignore. Around the same time, a new figure started appearing more frequently in the company's internal discussions. A financial consultant brought in to review risk structures across multiple divisions. His name was Victor Hayes, and unlike most people who worked under her father, he didn't speak in vague terms or avoid difficult topics. When he addressed Amber, his tone was direct, almost too precise, as if he already understood. More than he was saying, their interactions were brief, usually limited to meetings. But there was something about the way he observed details that made Amber uneasy. It wasn't distrust, it was recognition, the sense that he was noticing the same irregularities she had started to see. Outside the office, Ryan remained steady, unaffected by the tension that surrounded her professional life, grounding her in a way nothing else could. He didn't try to fix things he couldn't control. He simply stayed present, offering a kind of stability Amber hadn't experienced before. That contrast made everything else sharper. The colder her father became, the more she held on to what she had built with Ryan. Still, there were moments she couldn't ignore. Brief conversations where her father would mention the future of the company, in ways that excluded her current choices, references to alliances that hadn't been formally introduced, names of families and partnerships that suggested plans already in motion. He never asked her to change anything, but the implication was always there, waiting beneath the surface. Amber recognized the pattern because she had lived through it before, pressure that didn't demand immediate action, but slowly narrowed every option until only one remained. This time, she didn't intend to follow it. But she also understood something had already begun shifting, and whatever was coming wouldn't be as simple as disagreement. The shift happened on a night that felt completely ordinary until it wasn't. Amber Fletcher returned home later than usual, the kind of late that came with back-to-back meetings and decisions that left no room to think about anything else. The house was quiet when she stepped inside, but not in a way that felt peaceful. It was too still, too complete. Like something had already been removed before she arrived. She called out once, expecting an answer from somewhere deeper in the house, but nothing came back. That silence lingered just long enough to feel wrong. As she moved through the living room, her attention caught on a single detail, placed too deliberately on the table. An envelope with her name written across the front. There was no hesitation when she picked it up, but there was a shift in her expression the moment she opened it. Inside were legal documents, cleanly prepared, already signed. The name at the bottom belonged to Ryan Cole. For a second, her mind refused to connect the pieces. The words existed, but didn't make sense together. Then the realization settled in all at once, heavy and immediate. She didn't stop to think. She moved quickly through the house, opening doors, checking rooms, looking for something that would prove this wasn't what it looked like. The closet was half empty. Drawers had been cleared with intentions, and the absence of small things confirmed what the paper suggested. When she reached the bedroom that belonged to Sophie Cole, the impact was different, sharper, because it wasn't just space that was missing, it was presence. The bed was untouched, but the things that mattered weren't there. Amber stood still for a moment longer than she should have, then reached for her phone, dialing Ryan's number without pause. It didn't connect. She tried again, then again, each attempt ending the same way, until repetition replaced expectation. There were no messages, no explanation left behind. Nothing except what had already been written and signed. Time moved forward without her noticing, until the sound of someone entering the house broke through the silence she had been standing in. Her father stepped into the room with the same composed expression he always carried, his attention going directly to the documents in her hand. He didn't ask what happened. He looked at the paper as if he already knew. When he spoke, his tone remained even, almost detached, as though this was something inevitable rather than sudden. He told her that this was the outcome she should have expected, that people from different worlds don't stay where they don't belong, that waiting would only make things worse. Amber didn't respond immediately, not because she agreed, but because something inside her resisted the simplicity of what he was saying. He moved closer, pointing out the signature again, reminding her that the decision had already been made, that the only thing left was for her to accept it and move forward. When he mentioned Sophie, his words became more precise, not emotional, not concerned, just certain that everything would resolve itself without her interference. That was the moment Amber felt something shift. Not panic, not grief, but a refusal that settled deeper than either. She folded the documents without signing them, placing them back where they had been, as if returning them would undo what they represented. Hoopies. Her father watched without interruption, then gave a small nod, the kind that didn't signal approval, only acknowledgement that she had chosen the harder path. He didn't argue further, but the look he left her with carried something else, a quiet certainty that This situation would not unfold the way she expected. 6 months passed with nothing changing on the surface, but everything shifting underneath. Amber Fletcher kept moving through her schedule with precision, handling meetings, signing approvals, reviewing claims, maintaining control over a system that depended on consistency. The company had recently expanded its operational network, adding a large processing and storage facility connected to its insurance logistics, and that morning, she decided to inspect it in person. Rather than rely on reports, the environment was different from the corporate offices she was used to. Louder, less controlled, filled with movement that didn't wait for decisions to be made. Employees worked across wide spaces, handling equipment, organizing shipments, managing physical tasks that rarely intersected with her daily responsibilities. Amber walked through the site with the supervisors explaining performance metrics beside her, but her attention wasn't fully on the numbers. It shifted without warning. Pulled by something that didn't immediately make sense, across the far side of the facility, a man was lifting a heavy container, his posture slightly strained, his movements deliberate, practiced, as if he had been doing the same work for longer than expected. There was nothing unusual about him at first glance, just another worker blending into the routine, but something about the way he moved felt familiar in a way that didn't belong in that place. Amber slowed down without realizing it, her focus narrowing, cutting through distance until recognition replaced uncertainty. The man turned slightly, adjusting his grip. And in that brief moment, everything aligned. It was Ryan Cole. The realization didn't come gradually. It hit all at once, stopping her in place before thought could catch up. He looked different, not unrecognizable, but altered by time and environment, his clothes worn, his hands as marked by work. That didn't match the life he once had. Amber didn't hesitate after that. She moved across the space directly toward him, ignoring the supervisor calling after her, ignoring the attention that followed. When she reached him, there was no pause, no careful approach, only the force of everything that had been held back for months breaking through at once. Her hand moved before words did, the impact sharp enough to draw attention from nearby workers. But she didn't step back. Ryan didn't react the way someone would expect. He didn't raise his voice, didn't defend himself. He just looked at her, his expression steady but distant, as if he had already prepared for this moment and accepted it long before it happened. Amber demanded an explanation without lowering her voice, the questions coming without structure, driven by anger rather than control. He remained silent at first, his eyes scanning the surroundings, measuring the space, the people watching, the risk of speaking in the wrong place. When he finally spoke, his tone was low, almost restrained, telling her this wasn't where the conversation should happen. That response only made the situation tighter, more intense, because it sounded less like avoidance and more like a warning. Amber refused to step away immediately, but something in the way he held his position made her pause. Not in trust, but in recognition that whatever he was about to say didn't belong in the open. The distance between them remained small, but the space around them felt heavier, filled with something unresolved that had been waiting longer than either of them had acknowledged. They stepped away from the main floor where fewer eyes could follow. Amber Fletcher didn't wait for distance to settle before demanding the truth, her voice controlled but sharp, leaving no space for evasion. Ryan Cole didn't answer immediately, not because he didn't have one, but because choosing where to begin carried more weight than the explanation itself. When he finally spoke, it wasn't defensive, it was deliberate. Each word placed with care, as if saying too much too quickly could make things worse. He told her that the night before everything changed, her father came to see him, not in a formal setting, not as part of a discussion, but as a private visit that carried a different kind of authority. He wasn't alone, and that detail alone shifted the meaning of everything that followed. The conversation didn't start with accusations or anger. It started with clarity, a statement of what would happen, rather than a question of what could be negotiated. Ryan explained that he had been presented with documents tied to financial activity under his name, records that suggested involvement in decisions he never made, transactions structured in a way that could be interpreted as intentional misconduct. None of it was real. But it didn't need to be. It only needed to exist long enough to be used. Amber listened without interrupting, her expression tightening as the pieces began to form something she couldn't dismiss. He continued, explaining that her father made it clear how easily those records could be escalated, how quickly they could reach the level where consequences wouldn't be reversible. Messages wasn't framed as a threat. It was positioned as an outcome already prepared, something that would unfold if he chose to stay. When Amber tried to question the logic, Ryan didn't argue. He added the part that made everything impossible to ignore. Her father had mentioned Sophie, not directly, not in a way that could be repeated, but clearly enough to remove any doubt about what was being implied. That was the point, where the situation stopped being about him. He told Amber that leaving wasn't a decision he made freely, it was the only option that allowed him to control what happened next. The divorce papers were part of that structure, a way to make the separation look final, to remove attention, to make sure no one would question why he disappeared. Amber's response didn't come right away, not because she didn't understand, but because accepting it meant redefining everything she had believed for months. Ryan didn't try to justify the silence that followed his departure. He acknowledged it as something he chose to maintain, explaining that any attempt to contact her could have shifted attention back onto her, something he wasn't willing to risk. As the explanation settled, another layer began to surface, one that connected back to what Amber had already started noticing inside the company. She mentioned the irregular patterns, the delayed approvals, the changes in control, and Ryan confirmed that those weren't coincidences. They were part of a larger structure designed to isolate certain decisions and redirect influence. The connection became clearer when Victor Hayes was brought into the conversation. Not as a suspect, but as someone who had quietly identified inconsistencies in the financial records tied to Ryan's name. Amber realized then that what she had seen as pressure was actually preparation, a system being adjusted in advance to support a narrative that had already been planned. A week later, the Fletcher residence filled with people who believed they were attending another controlled gathering. Amber Fletcher arrived without hesitation, her presence drawing attention not because it was unexpected, but because something in her demeanor had changed. She didn't move through the room the way she used to. Measured and cautious, she walked directly to where her father stood, surrounded by familiar faces who had always aligned themselves with his authority. Conversation slowed as she approached, not out of respect, but because the shift in tension was impossible to ignore. Her father greeted her with the same composed expression, speaking as if nothing had been disrupted, as if everything remained within his control. Amber didn't respond to the tone. She stepped into the center of the room and spoke clearly enough for those nearby to hear, then continued without lowering her voice as attention spread. She didn't accuse him with emotion. She presented what she knew, outlining the financial records that had been structured under Ryan Cole's name, explaining how those documents had been prepared in advance, how they could have been used to justify consequences that were never earned. The room didn't react immediately, but the silence shifted, turning from polite attention into something more uncertain. Her father attempted to interrupt, dismissing her words as misunderstanding. But she didn't stop. She added the connection that couldn't be ignored. The internal changes within the company, the delayed approvals, the restructured authority that aligned too closely with the timeline of Ryan's disappearance. At that point, Victor Hayes stepped forward, not dramatically, but with enough presence to redirect the room. He confirmed that the financial inconsistencies had already been flagged, that external review had begun, and that the pattern extended beyond a single individual. That was the moment control began to fracture. Amber's father didn't raise his voice, but the certainty in his posture shifted, replaced by calculation that no longer held the same weight. The people around him didn't defend him. They stepped back in subtle ways, creating distance that hadn't existed before. Amber hesitated. Amber didn't wait for a response. She placed everything in the open and left it there, not as a request for explanation, but as a conclusion that no longer needed approval. When she finished, there was no confrontation, no escalation, just a silence that carried more consequence than any argument. Her father remained where he stood, but for the first time, the space around him felt smaller. Amber turned away without asking for acknowledgement, without waiting for anything to be resolved. Outside, the night felt clearer than it had in months, not because anything had been fixed, but because nothing remained hidden. Ryan Cole was waiting nearby, not with expectation, but with understanding that whatever came next wouldn't return them to what they had before. Amber stopped in front of him, holding that moment without hesitation, then spoke with a clarity that didn't leave room for interpretation. She told him that what had been taken from them couldn't be rebuilt the way it once existed, that choices made under pressure still left consequences behind. Even when the reasons were justified, Ryan didn't argue. He accepted it in the same way he had accepted everything else. Without resistance, there was no reconciliation, no promise of starting over, only an understanding that they would move forward separately, carrying what remained in different directions. Amber left without looking back, not toward the house, not toward the life that had been defined by control for too long. In the days that followed, investigations moved quietly but steadily. Leadership with it, the company shifted, and the structure her father relied on began to break under scrutiny that could no longer be contained. Amber didn't return to claim anything from it. She chose distance instead, building something that belonged entirely to her, without influence, without expectation. Looking back, she understood something that hadn't been clear before, that control doesn't protect what matters. It isolates it until there is nothing left to hold on to. And sometimes, the only way to move forward is to let everything that once defined you fall away completely.